begin the Gemara today towards the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Beis, about 10 lines from the bottom, where it says Tanan Hosam. Gemara is speaking about the fact that Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Hashanah also for Maisris. We discussed before, Benigay to Yerokis, what is the time that you establish the time for Maisris, for Yerokis? When is the cutoff? So the Gemara before said, the Lekita, when you pick it. If you picked some before Rosh Hashanah, then it's 1 year. If you pick some after Rosh Hashanah, it goes for the next year. So here, Gemara quotes a Mishnah regarding other things that do not go after the Lekita. It goes after other time periods in its growth. Tanan Hasam, so we learned over there a Mishnah in Masechta Maisris. Tilson, which is some kind of a spice, Mishatitzmach hatvua. When the tvua sprouts. I read it wrong. Again, Hatilson Mishatitzmach. The tilson, when it sprouts. The Gemara is soon going to explain what sprouts means. Hatvua va'azeisim, the tvua, which according to Rashi refers both to the grain and also to grapes, the vines, and va'azeisim and the olives, mishiyaviu shlish. So for them, the time when it's you go for the maisris, when it's chayiv and maisris, and when there's a cutoff date from the previous year to the next year, is a shlish. Whatever grew a third before Rosh Hashanah is for the previous year. After that, it goes for the next year. So the Gemara now explains, "My mishatitzmach." What does it mean when it says, "But by tilson the shiur is when it sprouts"? Mishatitzmach lezrayim. The answer is this tilson when it grows big enough and it has these seeds inside, and the seeds grow inside of it. So that's when it's considered to be that it's done for the chiyuv of maisris. The next thing it said there in this Mishnah is, and this is going to be the main focus of the Gemara now, Hatvua va'azeisim mishiviu shlish. When it comes to the tvua and zeisim, when it grows a third, that's the shear for when it's chayiv and maisris, and that's the time when it's the cutoff date, that it's considered to be from the previous year and not for the next year. Minan and Mili. So from where do we know this? So Rashi explains on this question of the Gemara Minan and Mili, the tvua and the zeisim are actually chayiv and maisris min ha-Torah. And that's what the Gemara is going to ask here, and it's going to bring psukim where we see that the shear is a shlish. When it comes to Yerokis, it's not chayiv and maisris min ha-Torah. When it comes to all other trees, it's also not chayiv and maisris min ha-Torah. So the fact that when it comes to Yerokis, it goes after the time that it's picked from the field, that's a takanim d'Rabbanan. And they chose that time period because the nature of vegetables is that it constantly needs to be watered in order for it to grow. So till the last moment, it's getting its energy from right now, you watering it. So therefore, when you pick it, that's when it's done. And that's when the cutoff time for the date of the previous year or the next year. When it comes to trees, the nature of trees is punkt vaker. Trees needs rain in the beginning of the season. And then for the rest of the season, even if there's no rain for the tree, or very little rain, the tree grows on its own because there's the sraf, there's a moisture, whatever it's called, sap or whatever, inside the tree that causes it to grow. And therefore by the trees, the halacha of maesters goes after chanota. We had it earlier. When it blossoms, when it begins blossoming, that's when it already got its chayas from all the rain. It's already all there potentially inside the tree. Now when it comes to tvua and zeisim, which is the grain, the vines, and the olives, over here, this is the only three, according to Rashi, that are chayiv and maisris min ha-Torah. And over here it says that it goes when it grows a third. So this is min ha-Torah and a dafka a third. So from where do we see this? And some say that it was the name of Rabbi Yosef Glili. Omakra, there's a pasuk that talks about Shemitah that says, Miketz Sheva Shonim, the end of the 7th year, B'moyed Shnas HaShemitah, in the time of Shemitah, B'chag HaSukkos, in the Yom Tov of Sukkos. So the question is, Shnas Shemitah, Maya Vidite. If it's a Yom Tov that comes already, the Sukkos after Shemitah, this is the mitzvah of Hakel, in the 8th year. So it's after Shemitah, so why does the Torah call it Shnas HaShemitah? And for the Gemara, so this is part of the question, sorry. B'chag HaSukkos Shmini, see. If it's already in Sukkot, so it's the 8th year. And for the Gemara, what the pasuk is saying is that sometimes you have produce in the next year that belongs to Shemitah. Kol tvua she'evia shlish b'shvius. If you have tvua that grew a third of it already in Shemitah year, lifnei Rosh Hashanah, before the Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, atanoeg by minik shvius b'shminis. You have the minig of Shemitah, it has the same halacha of Shemitah, even though it's already the 8th year. So that's why even though you could be already in Sukkot time, and you're gathering, you're cutting it in Sukkot time, but nevertheless, because it grew a third in Shvius, in Shemitah, so therefore it's still connected to Shemitah. So it's not Shemitah anymore, but the produce you have sometimes connected to Shemitah. That's why the Torah says here regarding Sukkot is Shemitah. That's the drasha that Rav Asi said. So Amalei Rav Zera Rav Asi, so Rav Zera says, no, maybe read this pasuk differently. If the Torah is saying that this Shemitah, that it's calling it Shemitah until Sukkot, v'dilmaloi ayil klal, maybe it did not begin growing at all. We're talking about Tvuah that did not begin growing at all before Rosh Hashanah, and the Kamar Achmana, and the Torah here is saying, Tashmit v'tezel at Chag Sukkos. That Shemitah continues going, the year of Shemitah and the halacha of Shemitah just continues going all the way to Sukkos. How do you know the pshat is that really the Shemitah stops by Rosh Hashanah? Elamai, if it grew a third from before, so then when you reap it later, because it grew a third before, that's why it's Shemitah. Maybe the Torah is saying that Shemitah goes all the way to Sukkos. And for the Gemara, lo yisal kedaitach. No, you can't say that. And the Gemara here is going to bring another pasuk as a source for this concept. That the point is because it grew a third before. The Chsiv, the pasuk when it talks about Sukkos, what does it say? V'chag ha'osif. The Torah calls it V'chag ha'osif b'tzeis hashana. When the year leaves, comes at the beginning of the year, when the previous year left, so it comes Sukkos, which is called Chag ha'osif. So the Gemara asks, my osif. When the pasuk here says osif, which literally means when you gather all your produce in the field, what does the Torah mean by this word osif? Is the Torah saying that this is a Yom Tov? It's letting you know when this Yom Tov is. It's a Yom Tov that comes in the time period when you gather the produce in the field. So, but then if so, the pasuk is redundant. Haksiv, right after that in the pasuk it says, Ba'aspecha, when you gather your produce in the field. The full pasuk is V'chag ha'osif b'tzeis hashana Ba'aspecha es masacha manasada. So it says it, that this is the time when you gather it in the field. Why does it say again in the beginning of the pasuk, V'chag ha'osif? So Ella, therefore, just what it should have said, V'chag b'tzeis hashana b'aspecha masecha. Just skip the word asif. It's gonna, if it's coming to tell you just the time, so it says afterwards. So my asif, Ella my asif. So what does asif mean? Kotzer. The word asif over here is not taich literally as gathering, but asif could also mean when you're reaping. It's also, in some sense, gathering, when you're reaping. And therefore, what the pasuk is saying is, the chag ha'asif, besides, in the time of Sukkot, usually this is a time when you gather the produce that's already lying out in the field. But it's also saying that there are some times that you are reaping on Sukkot, kotzer. And what is the pasuk saying? That what you reaped in this time of asif, it already grew a third in the previous year. That's what it means when it says, the Gemara is going to explain now. Let me just first explain it outside. The chag ha'asif, those things that in Sukkot, you're cutting off the tree right now, b'tzeis hashana. They grew already in the previous year that just left. Let's see it inside. The kimlu l'Rabbanan, and therefore the Rabbanan know the fact that the whole tvuah sheniktzera b'chag, anytime there's tvuah that you reap in Yom Tov Sukkos, b'yedua shehiviya shlish lefnei Rosh Hashanah. We know that it must have grown a third before Rosh Hashanah. If it wouldn't have grown a third before Rosh Hashanah, 2 weeks later, about, in Sukkos time, it would not be ripe to cut yet. So therefore when it says, V'chag ha'asif, what you're reaping now in Sukkos, b'tzeis hashana. It's coming from the previous year, already grew a third in the previous year. The kakarele b'tzeis hashana, the Torah is saying, that's from the previous year. So from here I see that if it grew a third, if it was cut in Sukkos time, that means that it grew a third in the previous year, and therefore we can say that that's the pshat also over here, beneged to what it said before, that Shemitah and the 8th year, that the 8th year still called Shemitah, it means the same point, that it grew from a third in the previous year. Amalei, one second. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah le Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks Rabbi Zera on this. How could this be? The kimlu l'Rabbanan ben shlish l'pachas mishlish. The Rabbanan know exactly that if you're reaping it in Sukkot, so they know exactly that it must have grown a third from the previous year. Maybe it grew a tiny drop less than a third from the previous year. How do they know that it must have grown exactly a third? And what's if it's a tiny drop less than a third? It won't be ripe in Sukkot. Maybe it will still be ripe in Sukkot. So that was his question. So how do we know this shiur of a shlish? Amalei, so Rabbi Zera answers Rabbi Yirmiyah, Lava minaloch, didn't I tell you once already? Leitapik nafshecha lebar mehilchaseh. Don't take yourself out of those shiurim of halacha that Chazal established. Kol midas chachamim kainhu. This is the way it is with all the shiurim of the chachamim, that they give an exact amount, and you can't start asking a question, what if it's a tiny drop less? So then it's not going to work, it's not going to be so. And the Gemara brings a bunch of examples. What's the examples here? Barboim saw. One example is the 40 saw of a mikveh, hu toivel. That's the amount that chachamim will mishayer that the full body of a person can be covered in the mikveh. So how about if it's barboim saw chasa kortiv? If it's 40 saw and it's missing a tiny drop, it's an eighth of this barboim saw. So you're going to say that it doesn't cover him. Maybe it will cover him. So then, even if it's again arbaim saw chasa kurtiv, any yachal litful ban. So we see that the shiur of arbaim saw is exact. You can't ask a question that if it's a drop less, then maybe it should also be good enough. Kebeitza, the shiur of a kebeitza regarding eating. If a person eats something that's Oster, so the Rabbanan said that the kebeitza is the shiur. By Rashi actually brings that this is benigeh to tumas eichlin. So by tumas eichlin, you learn out that the size for it to become tamei, it has to be large enough of how much could go down a person's throat. And how large is that? Like the shiur of an egg. Metamet tumas eichlin, and kebeitza chasa shumshum, if it's the size of an egg, and it's missing just a little tiny drop, like a little sesame. So then it's not large enough to be metamet tumas eichlin. So it's a tiny difference. So you're going to say that you can't make this distinction.
That wasn't the question. This you could see.
Yeah, I know.
But the shlish you can't see.
No, but it's the same. But he's making the point over here that what Chachamim have a Mesorah and a Kabbalah, that this is the shiur, and you can't ask any questions that maybe one person, his body is a tiny drop smaller, and therefore he can cover, or maybe one person's throat is a tiny drop smaller, and the same exact thing also with the tevuah that grows. Maybe the kernels of this tevuah is larger, so it could be a shlish, and maybe this kernel is bigger. How can you be mishayir? How can you give an amount for everything the exact same?
That's if you learn the question that way. But if you learn the question that, how do we know that, the Gemara is saying that because it's Sukkot, these 2 weeks.
It must be that it grew a shlish before. Correct.
Yeah, but we don't see anything. When we see we see it. When we have the
yeah, verstehe, okay. And a chanami. But nevertheless.
How big it's going to grow to know that it's a shlish.
That's
okay, let's continue. Let's continue. Another.
My other question is, Sukkot, how do you work on Sukkot?
So the Mefarshim say a guy cut it on Sukkot or on Chalamayid. Or Chalamayid, a Davar Avid and Chalamayid. Yeah, the Mefarshim say that.
Okay.
A third example the Gemara gives, Shloisha al Shloisha, when you have 3 by 3, it's boys I think it is, or Tfachim actually, 3 by 3 Tfachim, so that's the shiur, that's the smallest amount, that's Metame Medris. What's the medris? By azav, when you sit on something or you put weight on something, so what's considered to be something that's fit for sitting, the smallest size, if it's 3 by 3 tfachim. So shloisha al shloisha chaser nima achas. If it's missing just one thread, ain't a metame medris. So then it's not going to be metame medris. So again, you see this shiur. Some Mefarshim actually say, I think the Ritva says this, Nuhar Chachamim Takano. So there's 2 pshatim in this. One pshat is the Chachamim have a Mesorah. I don't know if it's mamash like a halacha l'maisha misinai, but the Chachamim have a Mesorah. This is the shiur, and that's what it is. Another pshat that the Ritva says is, and a chanami. If you want to start thinking and making distinctions, you could. But if so, you're never going to be able to make any shiur in Torah. There's no such a concept of shiurim. You'll always say, well, it depends. If it's a larger body, then you need 40 saw. If it's a smaller body, then you don't need. So if you want to make any shiur in Torah, you're going to have to say loy plug. You're going to have to decide on a certain shiur that goes in the average of most people, and that's what it is. So the same thing over here, benegeh to the shiur of the shlish, that from Rosh Hashanah to Sukkot, it must have grown a shlish. Does it have to mean that it's always that way? No, it's a certain average and loy plug. Otherwise, that's what he was saying to him. Tapik nafshecha lebar mehilchasa. So you can't create any halacha. You can't create any shiur. That's what the Ritva says. Hadam Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now the Gemara says Rabbi Yirmiyah himself, which was the one that asked this question about this shiur, and there's the famous Gemara in Baba Basra that says that he asked such a kind of question, and because he asked this question, they threw him out of the Bismedrash. And for a while he couldn't be in the Bismedrash because he asked this question. No, so now the Gemara says regarding this question here, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, Lav milsi damri. The question that I asked is not a question. Because over here, you can look and see, you could be mishayir to see that from Rosh Hashanah until Sukkot, it's ripe a third, and then it gets fully ripe when it comes Sukkot. And he brings a raya from a whole different case. The boy minei Chavrayim Rav Kahana. Because the Chavraya, there was a group of the Chachamim that asked from Rav Kahana the following question. The carbon oimer from the barley that you bring on the second day of Pesach that the Yidden brought when they came into Eretz Yisrael. From where did they have this barley that they were able to bring as a carbon? The Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael just a few days before Pesach, as the Gemara is soon going to bring. So from where did they have the barley ready to bring as a carbon? If you're going to say the al biyad nochri, that the barley that they used became already ripe in the possession of a goy, but ketzir chem amrachman, the Torah says it has to be yours. V'lei ketzir nochri, you can't reap from the barley from a goy and use that for the carbon. So now the Gemara interjects and asks, wait a minute, mimai da kriva? How do you know that first year when they came into Eretz Yisrael that they actually brought a carbon oimer? Maybe that year they did not bring a carbon oimer. So for this the Gemara brings a pasuk in Yeshua. That can't be. The pasuk there says, and they ate from the produce of the land the day after Pesach. So what do we see from here? From the next day after Pesach, that's when they ate from it. But from the day before, they did not eat from it. Right? So the akriva aimer. So from here we see, first they brought the carbon aimer, and v'hada achli. Only then were they able to eat from the new produce of the year, from the new grain of the year. So we see that they did bring the carbon aimer that year. So the question still remains, meheichan akriva. From where did they bring the carbon aimer? Amalehen. So Rabbi Yirmiyah, it was Rav Kahana, Rav Kahana answered them, Kol shaloi hevi shlish biyad nochri. If it did not ripen in the possession of a guy, a third, so then they can take it from the guy, and it grew mostly in the possession of a yid, so that's what they could bring. So if it ripened a third by the guy, then they wouldn't be able to. So that's what they brought it from. Frag the Gemara, v'dilma ayel v'loy kim lahu. But how could you measure this? Maybe it did ripen a third by a guy. If you're taking it right before, if you're cutting it the night when you have to bring the carbon, and now you see that it's fully ripe, and it was in the possession of Yidden for a few days, and how do you know how much it ripened in the possession of a guy? How could you tell? Elo, so what are you going to have to answer? Kim lahu. The Chachamim, the Yidden then, they were able to assess this. They were able to see this, whether it ripened a third in the possession of the guy or whether not. And therefore they knew that the barley they were using did not ripen a third in the possession of a guy. If so, we can say the same thing over here regarding the tvuah that becomes ripe in Sukkot, and we're saying that it must have become ripe a third on Rosh Hashanah. Kimlu, the Chachamim know how to assess this. They know how to measure and to see when a third of it was grown already. That's the raya that Rabbi Yirmiyah himself brought, that we see that it must be that there's a way how to assess this. Because otherwise, when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, how would they know how to assess whether it grew already a third in the hands of a guy or not? But the Gemara questions this raya. The Gemara says, it's no raya. V'dilme loy ayel klal. Maybe over there, it's not because it didn't grow a third already in the hands of a guy. Maybe over there, they got barley that belonged to a guy and it didn't grow anything by the guy. And then they bought it right away and it grew all in the possession of the Yidden. So dilme loy ayel klal. Maybe there they found barley that all started growing in their possession. Didn't grow by the guy at all. Aval heichel da ayel riva. But if it already grew, let's say a quarter, bein shlish lepachas mishlish leikim luhu, the Yidden would not be able to see a difference whether it grew a third in the possession of the guy, whether it did not grow a third. That to see exactly what amount ripens before or after, maybe that you can't tell. So the Gemara says, no, lo yisal kedaitach. How could you say this? How could you say that the Yidden got barley that grew fully in their possession? The pasuk says, when did they come into Eretz Yisrael? On Yud Nisan, the 10th day of the month. If you're going to say that it did not grow in the possessions of the guy at all, and it just all grew in the Yidden's possession after they came into Eretz Yisrael, is it possible that you should have barley that should fully grow in 5 days in the possessions of the Yidden? Okay, so the Gemara says, Elamai, and what's according to your pshat? So what are you going to say? The ayel rive oidanke. You're saying that it grew less than a third in the possession of a guy. So how much did it grow by a guy? Maybe a quarter, maybe a sixth. And then the rest grew in the Yidden's possession from Yud Nisan until when they needed it for the carbon, in 5 days. Akati, but the same question still remains. In 5 days it can grow 2/3 or maybe even 3/4, even more. It can grow that much in 5 days. So what are you going to answer? Eretz tzviksiv. The Torah says regarding Eretz Yisrael that it's a land compared to a deer that runs very quickly, and so too the produce in the land, it can ripen very quickly. So hachanami, if so, I can say already that Eretz Tzvi ksiv, but it says in the Torah Eretz Tzvi, and it's possible that when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, there was barley that just started growing, and it grew all in the possession of the hands of the Yidden, and it grew in 5 days fully, because it's a Eretz Tzvi. So what's the conclusion of the Gemara? This whole raya that Rabbi Yirmiyah was bringing, that the Chachamim are able to assess where it grows a third, is no raya. Because over there, not necessarily did it grow a third by a goy and then the rest by Yidden. Over there, it grew all in the possession of Yidden. Eretz Tzvi. It grew, it became ripe completely from the beginning till the end.
So, but also knocks off their parish also that from Rosh Hashanah.
Exactly. But Rabbi Yirmiyah's question, he held of that question. But Rav Asi held that that's the shiur that Chachamim kimluhu. Chachamim know. Okay, but now the Gemara has another question of this, and the Gemara is going to refute that raya. Maskef lo Rav Chanina asks the question, Umi matzah samris. Now how could you say the hai osif kotzeru, that this word osif is an extra word, because it already says ba'aspacha, and therefore you touched before that what does osif mean? It means kotzer, that this is what they're reaping in Sukkot because it grew a third from before Rosh Hashanah. But v'aksiv, the pasuk there says ba'aspacha migarnacha umyikvecha, that Sukkot you have to gather from the threshing floor and from the wine press. And what does that mean? The Torah here is saying regarding schach. The Torah is saying that for schach, what do you have to use? The leftovers from the threshing floor and from the wine press, that's kosher schach. Because it's not makabel tumah, it's not food, it's not a keli, and also it has to be gedulim in aretz, it grew from the ground. That's what the pasuk is saying. So what's the Gemara asking? The Gemara is asking, when it says in the pasuk, v'chag ha'osif, chag ha'osif is not coming to describe the time of when the yontif is. That the yontif of Sukkot is in the time when you gather. And then the question before would be a good question. The pasuk is redundant. It says right afterwards what the timing is. Ba'aspacha. Rather, what's the type of chag ha'osif? Chag ha'osif is just a name for the yontif. Chag ha'osif is another way of saying chag ha'sukkos, because the word osif is the name for schach. Schach is made from this material. So therefore the Torah is saying chag ha'sukkos, and when is chag ha'sukkos? Ba'aspacha, when you gather in the field. So the osif just is a name, so it's not an extra word. So the whole drasha we said before is off. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Zayda said, Ha milsa avoy biyadon. This question regarding the shlish, how do you know that if it grew a shlish in the previous year, that it belongs to the previous year? We thought we had a drasha here in this pasuk. And Rab Chanina came along and shada beinarge. He threw an axe into it. He refuted this drasha. So yeah, that's it. That drasha is not valid. Ela minolon. So from where do we know if it grew a third in the previous year, it belongs to the previous year? Kedetanya. So there's another drasha. In Brayso we learned Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef Eimer. It says in the pasuk, "V'osas esatvu l'shloish hashanim." This is the Torah giving the bracha in Shemitah time, and it says that the tfuah is going to grow for 3 years. So what does it mean that when it says that it's going to grow for 3 years? It's going to grow for the 6th, 7th, and 8th year, so the Yidden will have enough what to eat. So we darshan from this, al tikri l'shalosh. Don't read it that it's going to grow for 3 years, ela l'shlish. Read it that it grew a third. And what the pasuk is saying is that in the 6th year, if it grew a third in the 6th year, then it belongs to the 6th year. Then it's not the produce of Shemitah. Fragt the Gemara, how could you say this? So you need this for the pasuk itself. There's no room to make stama drasha of al tikri. The pasuk there is telling you the bracha that it's going to grow for 3 years. So the Gemara says no. For that bracha ksiv krachlina. There's another pasuk there that says uzratem es hashana shminis. You'll begin planting again in the 8th year. Va'achaltem en atfuah yoshan ad hashana atchias. And you're going to have from the previous tfuah that's going to grow until the 9th year. So the bracha of the fact that it's going to grow for 3 years, that you're going to have for the 7th, 8th, and 9th year, it already says that on another pasuk. So this pasuk is extra. So therefore we learn out that if it grew a third in the 6th year, that it belongs to the 6th year and not to the year of Shemitah. Tananasam, we learned in another Mishnah. Here there's another shiur, b'nigeya, to what grows, and at what point it's chayiv and ma'aser, and when's the cutoff date for the next year. So it says in the Mishnah, ha'oirez, v'ha'doichen, rice, and millet, v'ha'progin, and progin are not sesames because that's shumshumim, but it's poppy seeds. Va'shumshumin, sesame seeds. She'eshrishu l'fnei Rosh Hashanah, So by these, as long as it took root in the ground before Rosh Hashanah, misasrin l'shavar. So the Maisa goes with the past year. So this is a new shiur. Again, these are all things that are chayiv and Meiser midrabanan. And then over here, Chachamim established that the shiur should be at the time when it takes root. Umutarim b'shvius, and if it took root before Shemitah, it's going to be mutter and Shemitah. Taisus actually says that when it says in mutarim b'shvius, it's referring to Shemitah b'zman hazeh. Because if you were talking about Shemitah and Atayra, it could not be mutter b'shvius because it just took root before Shemitah. But it grew mostly in Shemitah. And this is a shiur midrabanan. This is shrishu over here. Chachamim were masakin this, as we'll see soon the reason. So therefore, Taisus says it's talking about Shemitah b'zman hazeh. Ve'im lav, if it did not take root before Shemitah, asurim b'shvius, it's going to be asur in Shemitah, u'misasrin l'shana haba. And the Meiser will go with the following year. Amar Rabbi, so now Rabbi will explain, where does it come this shiur of when it takes root in the ground? Amar Rabbanan, the Rabbanan established, we know the other shiurim that Rabbanan gave. Ilan basachanata, by a tree you follow when it blossoms. I mentioned before, because it already relies on the rain from the beginning. So you go from when it blossoms. That's when you establish the year. Tvua v'zeisim, when it comes to the grain and it comes to the olives, as we said before, that's learned at Benat Torah, basa shlish. That goes from when it grew a third. Yedek, when it comes to vegetables, basa lekita. So you go after when it's actually picked from the ground. Hani, these seeds that we mentioned before, that we said that it goes after when it takes root in the ground, keman shavinu rabbanon. According to which one of these shiurim are Chacham comparing it? Why suddenly over here do we have this new shiur of when it takes root in the ground? So the Gemara says, Hadama Rabbi. So Rabbi himself then said and answered his own question. That over here there's a reason Chachamim said that you should go after when it takes root. Why? Mitoich sha'asuyin prochin. Because these seeds, the nature is that you take a little bit at a time, and prochin means it crumbles in your hand. You take these seeds and you take it out of the pod or whatever it is, and it crumbles in your hand. And the point the Gemara is saying is, it's not all picked at the same time. It's picked over a long period of time in different times. And therefore, a person can get very confused what belongs to the previous year and what belongs to the next year. And they can get mixed together, and you're not going to give the meisters properly. So therefore, Azli Rabbanan Basa Ashrasha. The Chachamim said, let's establish the time when it takes root. They're all planted at the same time, and usually they all take root about the same time. So therefore, that's what we establish for the time of the meisters. So it's a takana b'derabbanan. So the Gemara says, why is it necessary to make this takana? What was your issue? Your issue is that it gets ripe in different time periods, and people take a little bit at a time in their hands, and therefore you can get confused what's from the new year and what's from the old year. So Abaye says, I have a simple answer for you. Amalei Abaye, we find in another place that you could do as follows. The Yitzber Garner L'Seichai, take all of it and make one big pile. Now, even though in this pile you have some that you picked from this year, some that you picked from the previous year, but it doesn't matter. Make one big pile, and v'nimtza toirim and achadash shabayal, achadash shabayim and ayashin shabayal, ayashin shabayim. What you do is take everything together from the new year and from the previous year, mix it very well together, and then when you're going to take the maestris, so even though you have a mixture here from this year and from the previous year, but proportionally it's going to come out that the maestri that you're going to take, part of the maestri that you're going to take is going to go on the previous year, and part of the maestri that you're going to take is going to go on the year to come, on the following year. And you can mix it together and do it this way. How do we know that you can do this? How do you know when you mix it together and take maestris, you can rely on the proportion and say that you're taking the proper proportion of maestris for the 2 years? So, because Milay Tanya, didn't we learn that? It says this in a Braisa. Rabbi Yosef ben Kippuraim Mishom, Rab Shimon Shizuri said in the name of Rab Shimon Shizuri regarding the beans. Pula Mitzri, these beans that are called Pula Mitzri, Shazaroi, Lezera, if they were planted to eat them as beans, Rashi says sometimes it could be planted and it's left to eat as a vegetable, but it could also be eaten. You eat the bean itself. So miktsasei hishrish lefnei Rosh Hashanah. Some of it took root before Rosh Hashanah. Or miktsasei hishrish la'achar Rosh Hashanah. Some of it took root after Rosh Hashanah. So the shiur is when it takes root. But what happens if it was mixed? Some from before and some from after. So what do? So Rab Shimon Shizuri says, Ein taimrim u'masrim mizeh al zeh. So you can't take the trumas and maisris from one part on the other part. You can't take the trumas and maesters from the previous year on the next year and vice versa. So you have a problem. So Rab Shimon Shizuri says, what do? Just pile it all in one pile together. Make one big pile. And if you mix it all together, so then it becomes mixed, and then you can rely on the proportion and say that the maises that you took the right amount for the previous year and an amount for the year to come. So Rab Shimon Shazuri says this eitzah. So why can't we say the same thing regarding what we had before with the rice and the seeds, all the seeds that even though there's from the new year, from the previous year, just mix it together and take maises in that way. So the Gemara answers, Amalei Rab Shimon Shazuri ka'amrit? You're bringing me a raya from what Rab Shimon Shazuri says that you can do this? We don't hold of him. Rab Shimon Shazuri savar. Rab Shimon Shazuri, he holds yesh bila. That this you can do this. Yesh bila means that this is an eitzah. You can go and mix it well together and then just separate for the previous year from the next year. You're going to say that proportionally you're separating for both years. Rabbanan Savri, but Rabbanan say, Ein Bila. The Rabbanan do not rely on this concept of Bila. You can't mix it together. According to the Rabbanan, even after you mix it together, so you're going to say that some of it was from one year, some of it was from another year, and you don't rely on just mixing it together, and that you're giving proportionally the right amount of maestras. So therefore, because we don't rely on that, Chacham wa Misakin, regarding the Eires and the Deichen, that you should just give the maestras according to when it takes root, and then usually you won't have that problem, because it takes root all at the same time in one year. It doesn't get mixed with another year.